The Sermon on the Mount is arguably the greatest sermon ever preached. Of course, it's the longest extended teaching of Jesus that we have anywhere in the Scriptures. And the Sermon on the Mount simply teaches us what it looks like to live as a citizen of God's kingdom. One of the most helpful ways that you can read the Sermon on the Mount is by beginning at the beginning. And so the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes. And that just describes the section of the sermon, the first few verses that describe the blessing that comes to those who live as citizens of God's kingdom. And there are 8 Beatitudes, and they function within the sermon because they're really a table of contents. In fact, there is a connection between each one of the 8 Beatitudes and every other section in the Sermon on the Mount. So everything that flows out of the Beatitudes is really an expansion, an explanation, an exposition of each of the 8 Beatitudes. There's even a kind of chiastic structure that happens throughout the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus preaches the sermon and bears out the meaning of the 8 Beatitudes. Beyond that, there is an inner logic in the Beatitudes themselves. And so not unlike the 10 Commandments, where half of the 10 Commandments have to do with your relationship to God, things like not having an idol, honoring the Sabbath day, having no other gods before God, those relate to God. The other half of the 10 Commandments relate to others. So don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, etc. The Beatitudes function in a similar way. The first 4 Beatitudes have to do with our relationship to God. The second set of Beatitudes have to do with how we relate to one another. And so this is the logic of it. There's 2 major sections, and actually each Beatitude flows into the next. So let's just take the first 4, for instance. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the humble. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. There's actually a logical connection between all 4 of those. Life in the kingdom begins with a recognition of our poverty of spirit. D.A. Carson says that to be poor in spirit is not to be necessarily poor financially or to be downtrodden in spirit, but rather to recognize that you have a kind of spiritual bankruptcy, that you don't have the spiritual resources that it takes to have a relationship with God. And really, life in the kingdom begins with that realization. I don't have what it takes. So I recognize my spiritual bankruptcy. That then leads to a place of brokenness over my sin, what the Bible calls mourning. When I'm broken over my sin, that gives me a degree of humility, a recognition that I don't have the resources in and of myself to address my own spiritual bankruptcy. When I come to the place of humility where I realize that I don't have what it takes and I can't provide my own resources, then I begin to get hungry and thirsty for the righteousness that God can give, what He can begin to produce in my life, not out of my own self-resources, but out of His resources. And so that process is really what it looks like to come to faith in Christ and begin to have desires for Him. A recognition I don't have what it takes, a brokenness over my sin, a humility to the point that I'm now hungry for God to do in my life what only He can do. Now, when I've experienced all of that, that begins to transform my character in such a way that I begin to exhibit the kind of life that looks like the last 4 Beatitudes. I become, for instance, a person of mercy. I become a person who is pure in heart. I become a peacemaking person. And I become someone who is willing to endure in faith even when I'm persecuted. So that's the flow of the Beatitudes. There's an inner logic. There's a connection between each Beatitude. The Beatitudes show us how we live as citizens of the kingdom, and then the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is really an exposition, an expansion of the meaning of those 8 Beatitudes.